In July 2018, a cell block door inside a Louisiana prison was found unlocked at 4 a.m. The inmate assigned to that bunk, Daniel Rivas, was gone. The official report contained only a few clipped sentences, and even those were blacked out by redactions. When his family asked for answers, they received cardboard boxes, silence, and pages that ended mid-line. Over time, more fragments surfaced: altered rosters, surveillance outages, inspection memos that contradicted one another. Every document seemed to erase more than it revealed. To his sister, the most haunting evidence was not violence or blood, but a single sealed envelope returned with his belongings, heavier than it should have been. Years later, that envelope still waits in her drawer, its silence louder than any verdict. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The prison stood like a block of stone against the Louisiana night. By 4 a.m., the air was still, thick with heat that had lingered since the day before. In the tiered corridor of cell block C, rows of metal doors reflected a faint hum of fluorescent light. Each door was supposed to be shut, locked, and checked, but when the guard on duty turned the corner, one door stood slightly open, the lock hanging loose against the frame. Inside, the bunk was empty. The mattress was pressed flat, a single indentation on the pillow. The inmate assigned to that cell, Daniel Rivas, was gone. No alarm had triggered. No key had been logged as used. The corridor camera, mounted above the block's entrance, flickered in frozen static. Later reports would claim it had been offline for 27 minutes, starting at 3:45 a.m. On the guard's clipboard, the space reserved for checks between 3:45 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. was blank, as though the pen had hovered but never touched. By the time word reached Daniel's sister, Marisol, the language of the prison had already shifted into defense. She did not receive an official call. Instead, another inmate's wife phoned her before dawn, whispering that something had happened. When she arrived at the prison gates, the air was already buzzing with rumor. A group of mothers and sisters clustered in the shade of the razor wire fence, passing stories in low voices. He was transferred overnight. No, they buried him here. Check the yard, you'll see fresh soil. Marisol pressed her palm against the hot metal of the gate, but the officer posted outside would say nothing more than "incident under review." When she asked if her brother was alive, he looked at the clipboard in his hand and said, "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to discuss." She was told to wait in the family area. The room was stale, its clock frozen at 8:15 a.m., though hours had already passed. When the warden finally appeared, he spoke in clipped sentences. "We regret to inform you there has been an incident. The inmate in question cannot be located. All measures are being taken." His voice held no tremor, no apology, only memorized lines. A cardboard box was brought in, sealed with a strip of brown tape. When Marisol opened it, she found her brother's possessions inside: a toothbrush worn to the base, 2 pairs of socks folded in prison issue style, several letters written on regulation stationery. At the very bottom lay a single gray envelope. It was sealed. Unlike the others, it had no return stamp, no marks, only his prison ID number in block letters. She lifted it. For paper, it felt heavy. Later, when she pressed the envelope to the dashboard of her car, it shifted with each bump of the road as though it contained more than a sheet inside. She could not bring herself to tear it open. That night, she sat with her mother at the kitchen table. They placed the envelope between them like a fragile object. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Across town, families of other inmates gathered, repeating the same words: ghost wings, secret transfers, bodies under concrete. None had seen Daniel. None knew more than she did. The following day, Marisol returned to the prison and asked to see the logbook. The guard at the desk turned the thick pages reluctantly. The lines were neat, each entry signed, until the hours surrounding her brother's disappearance. The pen strokes vanished. In the margin, a faint impression marked where a pen had pressed but not written. She traced it with her finger, the paper cool beneath her touch. A week later, she received a copy of the incident report. Half the paragraphs were obscured in thick black ink. Even the time of discovery was struck out. At the bottom, only the phrase remained: "Inmate not located." The prison walls glowed pale under the sun. From the outside, nothing seemed broken. The gates rose tall, the watchtowers unblinking. But inside, the silence pressed harder than any confession. In Marisol's kitchen drawer, the gray envelope rested alone, edges stiff against the wood. She touched it each morning as if checking it was still there. An empty bunk beneath buzzing fluorescent light lingered like an open wound. Marisol returned to the prison 2 days later, her mother at her side. They were met with the same clipped voices, the same measured steps of officers in dark uniforms. She asked for details, but was told the case was under administrative review. The warden's secretary handed her a form letter that promised a thorough investigation, without naming who would lead it or when it would begin. In the waiting room, Marisol noticed the rows of families. They sat quietly, eyes lowered, clutching photographs of sons, brothers, fathers. A woman leaned close and whispered, "They do this. They erase them." Another shook her head and insisted, "Transfers happen at night, unrecorded. He'll surface at another prison." None of them spoke with certainty, but every word pressed deeper into Marisol's chest. When she was finally escorted to a small office, a corrections officer slid a new box of belongings across the desk. Inside were scraps overlooked in the first return: a folded shirt, a bar of soap, a comb missing half its teeth. At the very bottom, wedged in the corner, she found another gray envelope. This one was sealed too, but unlike the first, its edges bore faint creases as if it had been handled many times. She lifted it gently. It had weight, the same unnatural heaviness. She slipped it into her purse before the officer could notice. Her mother whispered a prayer under her breath as they walked back out into the summer heat. Later that evening, Marisol sat at her kitchen table with both envelopes laid before her. They looked identical, except one was slightly worn at the corners. She resisted opening them, convinced that breaking the seals too early would destroy what little truth they held. She searched for official explanations. News reports offered only fragments. Incident, investigation. No foul play suspected. The prison spokesperson claimed the cameras had gone offline during a scheduled update. But the wording shifted between articles. One described the outage as 30 minutes, another as 27. Another said it never happened at all. Marisol pressed harder. She filed a request for surveillance records. Weeks later, a manila folder arrived by mail, its contents startling in their absence. Frame after frame showed static. A typed note at the bottom read, "Footage unavailable, maintenance in progress." But something strange surfaced. On one page, a log sheet of camera outages listed precise start and end times for the entire year. The gap covering July 14th had been circled in pencil, then erased, leaving only a faint gray halo around the date. Her uncle, a retired guard from another facility, examined the sheet under a lamp. "This isn't maintenance," he muttered. "Cameras don't fail by schedule." His words only sharpened the divide between belief and fact. The families whispered about underground tunnels, hidden transfer wings, but the records, sparse as they were, revealed nothing more than silence. Red herring threads tangled around her. One neighbor insisted Daniel must have been taken in a secret state transfer. "They move people when they want to bury them," the woman said, eyes wide with certainty. Another relative argued the opposite. Daniel had to have escaped, bribing a guard to let him slip out under cover of darkness. Both versions conflicted, and neither held proof. That night, Marisol stood in her small yard, the envelopes pressed to her chest. She imagined them as vessels, each carrying something more than paper, something heavier than the silence offered by officials. She felt they were not just letters, but artifacts of a disappearance, ritual objects now, passed through hands unwilling to speak aloud. The cicadas shrieked in the trees as she whispered her brother's name. She swore she heard it echo faintly, like a syllable carried back from inside the walls. Back at the prison, the logbook remained locked in a cabinet, its missing entries untouched. A guard flipped past the blank lines during a night audit and tapped his pen against the wood. The sound carried down the corridor, sharp and hollow. The envelope on Marisol's table seemed to shift under its seal. The days that followed brought no answers. For Marisol, each morning began with the same ritual. She would wake before dawn, set water to boil on the stove, and sit at the kitchen table staring at the 2 sealed envelopes resting on the wood. Their gray surfaces caught the weak light from the window. Ordinary prison stationery, but heavier than it should have been. She had not opened them. The weight was not just paper, it was her brother's absence pressed into shape. To understand what had happened, she started piecing together Daniel's last full day in prison. Other families told her who to contact. Some pointed toward relatives of inmates who had shared a cell block. Others toward volunteers who brought scripture and newspapers through the gates. From them, she gathered fragments. That morning, Daniel had eaten breakfast in the chow hall. Plain oatmeal, a single piece of toast. One inmate remembered him standing in line humming a tune, soft enough that only those near him could hear. In the yard later, he kept to himself, pacing along the far fence, tracing the concrete with his eyes as though following invisible marks. In the evening, he played cards with 2 others, then returned to his cell before lights out. By all accounts, he carried no tension, no sign of plans. He folded his uniform, placed his shoes neatly beside the bunk, and lay down before curfew. The guard on that round noted nothing unusual, yet by 4 a.m., the cell stood empty. Marisol tracked down Tyrone Hayes, a man who had served time in the same tier. Released just months earlier, he agreed to meet her in a diner off the highway. He stirred his coffee with a plastic spoon, eyes scanning the room as though still inside the walls. Daniel wasn't restless, Tyrone said. Not like the ones about to make a move, but he kept saying something strange. He said, "I'll be walking by dawn." I thought he meant parole or a transfer, but no paper came through, Marisol pressed. Did he have visitors, notes, anything unusual? Tyrone shook his head. Only thing I remember, the last night he was there, he hummed that tune again, over and over, like he was reminding himself of it, and when lights went out he said, "Doors don't always stay locked." The words clung to her. Was it a statement of hope or knowledge? When Marisol later visited the prison chaplain, Father Keene, he confirmed hearing the same song from Daniel. A slow rhythm tapped against the wooden pews. But it didn't sound like joy, he told her. It sounded like someone marking time. Back inside the facility, she requested to see the corridor where her brother had last been. The officer escorting her refused, citing security protocols. Yet she glimpsed enough through a cracked door. The floor bore a faint boot print, pressed into the dust along the wall. When she asked whose it was, the officer replied that it had been checked and dismissed. The impression was larger than her brother's shoe size. She noted that in silence. Weeks later, a copy of the incident photographs arrived in her mailbox. Most showed nothing but blank corridors, overexposed by the camera flash. But one image captured the partial boot print. No scale marker, no notes. The file identified it only as miscellaneous trace. To the system, it was nothing. To Marisol, it was a door opening in the wrong direction. Outside the prison, the rumors kept shifting. Some families swore Daniel had bribed a guard and walked out through a staff exit. Others believed he had been transferred into a secret wing where problem inmates disappeared from records. The truth bent with each retelling. In her kitchen, the envelopes waited. And now, a letter had arrived by mail. The handwriting on the front mimicked Daniel's, but it was uneven, as though written with the wrong hand. The envelope was gray, identical to the others. Inside was only a blank sheet. No message, no date. Her mother wept when she saw it. "It's him," she said, clutching the paper. "He's alive. He's trying to reach us." But Marisol felt the weight differently. It seemed less like proof and more like an echo, manufactured to keep them searching. Belief and fact collided again. She laid the new envelope beside the others. 3 now, each sealed or blank, each heavier than meaning. The edges lined up like a series of unanswered questions. One evening she drove back to the prison fence. The towers loomed, lit by harsh white floodlights. She watched the guards trace their paths in the narrow walkways above. clipboards swinging at their sides. Each step seemed scripted, each gesture measured. She thought of the logbook again. Its blank lines. Paper could conceal as much as it revealed. A voice startled her. Another woman had appeared at the fence, a mother holding a photograph of her own son. She whispered, "They don't lose them. They keep them where we can't see." Her eyes never left the walls. Marisol turned away, the envelopes heavy in her purse. That night, she spread them across her kitchen table and photographed them with her phone. Angles, corners, the faint creases in the second envelope. If the system erased traces, she would create her own record. She printed the images and taped them to the wall, building a private archive. The boot print photo joined the display. Next to it, the log sheet with erased times. Below, the gray envelopes pinned in sequence. An ordinary kitchen had become a map of silence. Her mother entered the room and stopped in the doorway. "It looks like an altar," she whispered. Marisol didn't answer. The envelopes seemed to watch her, waiting. Down the hall of cell block C, the bunk remained stripped. The fluorescent light above flickered, buzzing in an endless rhythm. Guards passed without stopping, their pens tapping against clipboards that recorded nothing. One boot print led toward the staff exit door, swallowed by shadows. Summer pressed heavy across Louisiana as Marisol carried her growing archive from kitchen drawer to dining room wall. Photographs of the gray envelopes, photocopies of redacted reports, a blurred image of the boot print. Each was pinned beneath the glare of a single lamp. The wall became less a memorial than an evidence board, a private ledger of what officials refused to say. Her next step was the request for official documents. The Department of Corrections mailed a packet weeks later, thick with reports. But every page was scarred. Black bars cut across sentences, names were scrubbed, even times were blotted out. Entire paragraphs were erased, leaving only fragments of bureaucratic language. One page began with, "During the hours of July 14th," and ended with a solid block of ink. Still, one detail slipped through. A keycard record showed that a staff door in cell block C had been accessed at 2:17 a.m. The name of the officer was blacked out, but the timestamp remained. The report called it routine. Marisol circled it in red and taped it to the wall beside the boot print photo. Families outside the prison whispered their own interpretations. Some believed Daniel had bribed a guard to slip out unnoticed, an escape bought with hidden money. Others said the missing keycard log proved collusion, a staff member turning the lock for him. Each rumor spread like oil on water, spreading further, staining every conversation. For Marisol, these stories twisted the image of her brother. At the kitchen table, an uncle argued he must have planned it for months. "No one just walks out," he insisted. Her mother shook her head furiously. "Daniel never had that kind of reach. They're blaming him to hide their own mistakes." The divide cut through the family, as though silence from the prison demanded they invent answers themselves. Marisol returned to the chaplain, Father Keene, asking if Daniel had spoken of escape. He shook his head. He was frightened, yes. He believed the system would swallow him, but he never spoke of leaving. He left me a letter. I still have it. From a drawer in his study, Keene produced a gray envelope. The seal was torn, but when Marisol opened it, the paper inside was gone. Only the faint outline of a folded page remained, its absence sharper than any words. "It was there," Keene whispered. "I don't know who removed it. One week I had it, the next it was empty." She took the hollow envelope home and added it to the board. 4 now, each more cryptic than the last. From ordinary stationery, they had become objects in a ritual. Tokens passed from hand to hand, stripped of their contents, carrying silence heavier than paper. She wrote letters to the Department of Corrections demanding unredacted copies. Each response came back the same: denied for reasons of security. One envelope arrived back to her with only a single word stamped on the page inside: confidential. No signature, no letterhead. At night, she lay awake listening to cicadas and wondered if she was being watched. Then came a slip. Among the packet of documents, one page bore the faint outline of a name where the black bar did not fully obscure the print. It was jagged, a partial trace, but visible. The last letters stood clear. Insan. Whether guard, officer, or visitor, she could not tell. But it was the first unguarded trace of another hand in the shadows. The discovery carried no comfort. It did not narrow the mystery. It widened it. If one name leaked, how many more had been buried under layers of ink? Back at the prison, Marisol pressed to meet with the warden again. He spoke from behind a desk, hands folded, eyes flat. "Your persistence is noted," he said, "but all findings remain internal." The phrase landed like a verdict. As she left, her eyes caught the corkboard behind him. It was crowded with memos, shift charts, color-coded rosters. She glimpsed July's calendar pinned in the corner, then realized the date of Daniel's disappearance was marked with a circle in red pen. The sight froze her. When she blinked again, the page was already turned, hidden by another document slid over it. At home, she traced the blurred name with her finger. She folded the empty envelope from the chaplain and placed it beside the others. The board looked less like evidence than a shrine. Each envelope a relic pulled from silence. Each redaction a prayer left unanswered. The redacted page ended with a name still visible through ink. By late August, the heat had thickened to the point where the air itself felt weighted. Marisol spent more time at the courthouse steps than at home, listening to the cluster of families who gathered there with their own stories. Each disappearance carried different details, yet every account returned to the same end: silence inside the files. One woman swore that her son had been moved underground to what she called a ghost wing. Another insisted that men vanished into work camps under fake names. The rumors circled until they hardened into belief. None of them had proof, only fragments. A visitor pass that no longer scanned. A letter returned with no explanation. Marisol tried to push past the folklore and find something tangible. She turned again to Father Keene, hoping he had more. The chaplain looked tired. Shadows gathered under his eyes. He remembered Daniel kneeling in the chapel the week before his disappearance, silent except for a whispered hymn. He was afraid, Keene admitted. He said a shadow ledger was being kept, a list of names. I thought it was fear talking. From his desk, he produced yet another envelope. Gray, like the others. Daniel had left it with him for safekeeping. Marisol broke the seal carefully. Inside was nothing. No letter, no scrap, not even dust. Only the outline of a fold remained. The chaplain's hand trembled as he closed the drawer. I didn't open it until after, he said. It was whole before. Someone took the page. Back home, Marisol added the hollow envelope to her board. 5 in total now. Their presence had shifted. No longer just her brother's possessions, but relics of something ritualized. Each envelope felt like a container not of words, but of absence. Each seal, a silence that could not be broken. Her mother lit a candle beneath them, whispering Daniel's name, as though the envelopes themselves required prayer. Still, she chased facts. Phone records arrived after weeks of delay. They showed Daniel had made no calls in the month before he vanished. For a man who had phoned every week without fail, the silence was stark. The last recorded call dated back to June, a short conversation with Marisol herself, lasting only 5 minutes. The report ended there. The family tried to reason it out. Had he been cut off from phone privileges? Was he being punished? The paperwork gave no explanation. On the margin of the final page, someone had scribbled a note in pencil. Privileges suspended. No date, no signature. Just those 2 words. Neighbors added their own voices, muddying the water further. A man who lived near the prison claimed Daniel had been seen stepping into a van in the early morning. Another said he heard digging inside the yard after midnight. Each account contradicted the other, but both spread quickly. Marisol drove past the prison again. The floodlights washed over the walls, bleaching them pale. In the distance, she saw a group of families clustered in the parking lot, candles flickering in their hands. They weren't waiting for answers anymore. They were holding vigil. At her kitchen table, the envelopes seemed to breathe under the lamp's heat. She lined them up in sequence, oldest to newest, a silent chronology of disappearance. Her wall of papers resembled less an investigation than a ritual altar now. A place where documents became icons and silence became scripture. She touched the newest envelope. The seal was brittle but intact, its weight identical to the first. She whispered aloud, "What did you leave inside?" But no answer came. That night she dreamed of paper scattering like ash across the prison yard, carried by the wind into the floodlights. She woke before dawn. The envelopes still in place, unchanged yet heavier than ever. At the courthouse, whispers spread again. Some said Daniel had been killed for refusing to cooperate in a gambling ring run by guards. Others said he had slipped free and was living somewhere under another name. Each story offered certainty, yet none produced a single piece of proof. The rumors thickened like smoke. The truth remained as hidden as the ink struck from the files. The chaplain's fingers shook as the hollow envelope fell open. September carried storms across Louisiana, but inside the prison, nothing moved. Each request Marisol filed returned with the same phrase, "No records available." The Department of Corrections claimed the investigation was ongoing. Months had passed, yet no progress appeared. What arrived instead were memos filled with empty language. Procedural compliance ensured. No breach identified. Each sentence canceled the one before. Marisol kept pressing. She filed Freedom of Information requests, attaching every page of evidence she had gathered. Weeks later, the answers arrived in thin envelopes, each stamped with the same denial. Security concerns, confidentiality, internal review. The wording changed slightly each time, as if a machine were generating them. But a former clerk slipped her a different folder, copied quietly after hours. Inside were rosters from the night Daniel vanished. Lines of names ran neatly until the column for 3 a.m. There, 2 officers were listed for duty who, according to later payroll sheets, had been off shift. Someone had altered the schedule. One name was smudged as though erased and written again. She pinned the pages to her board, arrows pointing to the faint changes. To her, the handwriting did not match the rest. She photographed it, enlarging the erasure until the ghost of the first name surfaced faintly. The prison administration called it clerical error, yet the mistake aligned too neatly with the hour of her brother's disappearance. Red herrings thickened. In the courtyard, relatives muttered about Daniel's debts. "He played cards," one man said. "If you can't pay, they make you disappear." Another swore that guards ran an underground gambling ring, and Daniel was taken because he owed. These whispers pulled like undertow, dragging attention away from the evidence in her hands. Marisol weighed the rumors against the artifacts. 5 envelopes, 2 rosters, 1 photograph of a boot print. The envelopes were ordinary, yet they had become more than objects. Her mother now lit a candle each Sunday night before them, praying aloud, turning the kitchen into a chapel of silence. Marisol resisted the ritual but felt its gravity. One evening, she spread the altered roster across the table. Her uncle, who had worked years as a guard, leaned over it with a magnifier. "See here," he said, pointing to the erased line. "That's pencil rubbed out, not ink. Someone covered their tracks." "Why erase if it was nothing?" she asked. He didn't answer. The silence stretched. Outside, storm winds tore branches from trees. The power flickered. For a moment, the kitchen lamp dimmed. And in that dimness, the envelopes looked like shadows pressed flat, waiting for breath. The following week, Marisol received another denial letter. The return address bore no name, only Records Division. Inside was a single page stamped in bold. Request denied. Case closed. Yet the case was not closed. Not in public, not in her family's eyes. She placed it beside the others. Her wall was no longer just paper. It had become an archive of erasure. Every artifact she collected testified not to her brother's presence, but to the system's silence. Late that night, unable to sleep, she stared at the board. She imagined the erased names rising from the paper, filling the room in ghostly whispers. She thought of Daniel's voice humming, marking time. At the prison, the bunk remained stripped, sheets folded against the wall. Guards walked the tier as though nothing had happened, their pens tapping against clipboards already filled with blanks. One roster line erased, leaving only a ghost of pencil. By the time autumn settled in, Marisol had built her own archive large enough to fill a box. Each page was a copy of an erasure, rosters with names rubbed out, reports with paragraphs blacked over, surveillance logs ending mid-sentence. She stored them carefully, wrapping the edges to prevent further smudging, as if handling fragile artifacts. The families gathered more often now, not only outside the prison gates, but at courthouse steps. Together, they carried placards demanding answers, though most were met with indifference. Officials passed by in pressed suits, eyes fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the cluster of photographs and candles lining the steps. One afternoon, a woman tapped Marisol on the shoulder. She introduced herself as Ellen Price, a lawyer who had been following the rumors. "You're not the only one," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "I've seen 3 other cases, all with redacted files. The pattern is too clean." Marisol invited her home. Ellen sat before the evidence wall, tracing each envelope with her eyes, reading the margins of each document. She lifted the altered roster carefully and held it toward the lamp. "This," she said, "is not a clerical error. This is deliberate. And if the state refuses to act, we will petition the court ourselves." The idea carried weight. For years, the family had been told to wait, to remain patient. Now, someone outside the bloodline was offering a way forward. Ellen drafted a petition demanding release of the full investigative record, citing systemic neglect. She filed it under public interest. In the meantime, another document surfaced. A retired inspector mailed Marisol an old report he had kept from 2017. It described faulty locks throughout the prison, including cell block C. The report warned of potential failures if maintenance was not addressed. The inspector noted that no action had been taken. Marisol stared at the lines, each sentence sharper than the next. The locks had been compromised long before Daniel disappeared. She taped the inspection report to the wall beside the rosters. The board looked crowded now, a mosaic of shadows and blanks. In the center hung the envelopes, still sealed. They drew the eye like dark stones in a pale river. At vigils, relatives lit candles before copies of the documents. The envelopes passed from hand to hand, not opened but held aloft, symbols of absence. Some whispered prayers as if the paper itself carried fragments of their loved ones. The ritual deepened. What began as stationery had become icon. New rumors spread just as quickly. One local man claimed Daniel had been seen in Texas under a different name, working construction. "I saw his face," he insisted. "He's alive, hiding." The story passed through neighborhoods, igniting hope in some, anger in others. Marisol searched records for fingerprints, but none matched. The rumor dissolved, leaving only more doubt. Ellen prepared for court. She carried the petition in a thick folder, including photographs of the envelopes. The judge granted a preliminary hearing, setting a date weeks later. On the morning of the session, Marisol walked through the courthouse clutching one envelope in her hand, sealed and heavy. Ellen argued that it represented more than a letter. It was the only unaltered artifact of her brother's existence at the time of disappearance. "When documents vanish, when rosters change, when reports are blacked out," she said, "we are left only with what remains. And what remains is this envelope." The courtroom was hushed. The clerk accepted the envelope as exhibit evidence, labeling it family submission, Rivas case. Marisol felt a flicker of relief. At last, the silence was recognized within the system itself. But hours later, when the clerk returned the exhibit box, it was empty. The envelope was gone. Panic spread through Marisol's chest. Ellen demanded explanation, but the clerk only shrugged. "Items are processed. Check with records." Records had no note of the item, no log, no receipt, no chain of custody. It was as if the envelope had never existed. That evening, Marisol returned home hollow. On the evidence wall, gaps stared back where she had removed the envelope for court. Now nothing filled its place. Only the photograph she had taken earlier remained. She pinned it quickly, desperate to restore shape to the archive. Yet the image was flat, lacking weight. Unable to replace the vanished object, her mother wept. They are erasing him piece by piece, she said. Ellen placed a hand on Marisol's shoulder. This is proof, she whispered. Proof that the silence is not accident but design. But proof without evidence felt like smoke in her hands. That night, Marisol dreamt again of Daniel humming. The sound came from the far end of a corridor where a door stood ajar. She followed but found only envelopes piled high, their seals unbroken. When she touched them, they crumbled into ash. She woke before dawn, heart pounding. The envelopes on her wall still held shape, but the absence of the one lost in court seemed larger than their presence. Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with rain. Candles from the vigil burned out, leaving wax puddled like white scars across the concrete. The families dispersed silently into the wet streets. The exhibit box returned from the clerk's office, completely empty. The call came on a Monday evening, just as the sun slipped below the rooftops and shadows lengthened across Marisol's kitchen wall. The voice on the line was low, hoarse, and hesitant. "My name doesn't matter," the man said. "But I was there that night. I was supposed to be on duty." It was Michael Donnelly, a former guard whose name had been scrubbed from payroll after the summer of 2018. His voice cracked with nerves as he explained how his shift had been reassigned hours before Daniel disappeared. "I'd never had that happen before. Swapped out without warning. And when I asked why, the lieutenant told me not to ask again." Marisol clutched the receiver tightly, glancing at the evidence wall. "Why are you telling me this now? I can't hold it anymore," Donnelly whispered. "They'll say it was clerical, but I know it wasn't." He described how, weeks later, he had been ordered to sign a roster sheet that no longer matched the night he remembered. The times had been shifted. His name had been moved. "They wanted a clean record," he said. "They didn't want anyone to know who was really there." Marisol asked the question she feared. "Did you see my brother leave?" Donnelly's silence stretched so long she thought the line had gone dead. Then he spoke. "I didn't see him, but I saw an officer escort someone through the staff corridor around 2:20 a.m. I couldn't make out the face. I wasn't supposed to be there. When they noticed me, I was told to turn around and forget." Her pulse quickened. "Do you know the officer's name?" He hesitated. "No, the roster won't show it anyway." The call ended abruptly, as though the air itself had cut it off. She stared at the receiver, the hum of the dial tone filling the room like static. That night she told Ellen, the lawyer, who urged her to write down every word. "Testimony may vanish," Ellen said. "Paper holds longer." Days later, an envelope arrived at Marisol's mailbox. Gray, regulation size, sealed. Inside was a photocopy of a shift change memo. The date matched the night of Daniel's disappearance, but the timestamp in the corner had been altered. The ink grew faint near the end, as though overwritten. Someone had shifted the time to disguise who should have been present. Marisol pinned the memo to the wall, another artifact in the chain of silence. Her mother lit another candle. "He is speaking through these," she murmured, gesturing to the envelopes. Marisol resisted the thought, but she couldn't ignore how the objects had grown heavier with each arrival. They were no longer just stationery. They had become vessels of rumor, ritual, and now, evidence. Still, red herrings multiplied. At vigils, whispers spread that Daniel had not vanished at all, but had been released quietly under another identity. Some claimed to have seen him walking the streets of Baton Rouge. A man even insisted he had bought cigarettes from Daniel at a gas station. Each rumor contradicted the last, but all carried conviction. Marisol drove to Baton Rouge to chase one lead. She waited outside the gas station for hours. No familiar face appeared. When she questioned the cashier, he shook his head. "I don't know anyone by that name." The drive back felt longer than the distance, each mile a reminder of how easily belief could disguise itself as memory. Back home, the envelopes waited. She touched them one by one, half expecting them to answer. They did not. The phone rang again, 3 nights later. Donnelly's voice returned, more strained. "They know I spoke," he said. "I can't talk long." "What do you mean they know?" Marisol asked. "I heard a knock on my door. Nothing there. Just silence. But I know how it works. They're reminding me." His breathing quickened. "Listen to me. Your brother didn't plan this. He was taken. Whether out the front or through the files, he was taken. The line clicked. Dead. Marisol wrote down his words immediately, each sentence pressed into the page with shaking hands. She taped the paper beside the altered roster, drawing an arrow between them. The evidence wall was more than a collection now. It had become a story told without consent, each document an unwilling witness. The rumor of Daniel's gambling debts resurfaced, persistent and insistent. Families insisted he had owed money, that the debt explained the silence. Others swore he had been punished for refusing to participate in something larger, something unspoken. Each story left her feeling as though she were drowning in smoke. Yet the documents remained. The memo's altered timestamp, the erased roster, the missing log entries. They pointed not to her brother's choices, but to systemic shadow. Ellen pressed forward. "We'll file an amended petition," she said. "With Donnelly's testimony, we can force disclosure." But Marisol hesitated. Testimony was fragile. Documents vanished. Even envelopes disappeared in court. She began to wonder whether the truth itself could be sealed, erased, rewritten, until nothing remained. That night, she sat alone, staring at the wall until her eyes burned. The envelopes glowed under the lamp like muted lanterns. Their seals seemed to pulse with withheld breath. She thought of Daniel humming in the dark, marking time. Somewhere, a door had opened when it should have been locked. Somewhere, a record had been erased when it should have been permanent. Somewhere, someone had turned a key at 2:17 a.m. and walked into silence. The phone remained on the table beside her, its cord coiled like a sleeping snake. She wondered if it would ring again. She wondered what voice would speak next. Confession, rumor, or nothing at all. In the early hours, Marisol woke from a restless sleep to the sound of her own door. A knock, soft but distinct. She froze in bed, listening. It came once more, then vanished. When she opened the door, the porch was empty. Only the night air pressed against her skin. She returned inside. The envelopes lay undisturbed on the table. Yet for the first time, she felt as though they were watching her. The call cut off after a knock echoed through the line. The courthouse steps filled again with candles and photographs. Reporters had begun circling the story now, their cameras sweeping over faces lined with exhaustion, their microphones catching fragments of rumor more than fact. Headlines appeared in local papers. Family demands answers in vanished inmate case, and silence from state raises questions. Each article reprinted the same images of vigils, but none showed what Marisol carried inside her purse. The newest gray envelope, sealed and stiff, delivered without return address. The envelope had arrived a week after Donnelly's last call. Inside was not a letter but a photocopy of a chain of custody log. Rows of signatures stretched across the page until the final line. There, a blank. A space where someone should have signed to confirm transfer of evidence. The absence was as deliberate as ink. Ellen studied the sheet in Marisol's kitchen. "This is damning," she said. "Without a signature, no one can prove where the evidence went. It's a hole carved right through the record." Marisol pinned the log beside the altered roster and shift memo. The wall grew more crowded, the envelopes forming a column in the center like gravestones. Outside, the rumors multiplied. Some said Daniel had been part of a wider pattern. Other inmates, too, had vanished in past years, their files sealed or missing. The press whispered about 2 cases in nearby prisons. One man who vanished from a transport van. Another whose paperwork ended with the phrase, "released," though no record of his release existed. The duality deepened. Belief took hold among families that a network existed, a system designed to erase. Fact remained harder, thinner, clinging to scraps of paper. Reporters asked Marisol for interviews. She refused at first, fearing her words would be twisted, but Ellen persuaded her. The silence works because it isolates you. If you speak, others may come forward. On camera, Marisol held one of the envelopes in her hand. She described how each had arrived without explanation, how each carried weight without words. The image ran in the evening news. A woman with tired eyes holding a sealed envelope as if it were proof of life. The next morning, the newspaper ran a front-page photograph of the same envelope. The headline read, "Gray paper, heavy silence." For a moment, it felt as though the story had shifted. No longer whispers between families, but a public echo. Yet the response from officials was swift. No evidence supports these claims. All records remain intact. Their statement carried no detail, only denial. At night, Marisol stood in her yard and watched neighbors gather at the fence line. Some brought candles, others brought rumors. One man said a guard had confessed off the record that Daniel was buried under the yard. Another insisted he had escaped through a laundry truck. Both stories spread, and by dawn, the truth was buried again. The envelopes had taken on a new meaning. At vigils, people touched them as if touching relics. They were passed carefully from hand to hand, not opened but displayed. Some believed they contained secrets. Others feared they contained nothing at all. Marisol began to see them differently too. They were no longer just personal artifacts. They had become symbols of the case itself, icons of the system's erasure. Each one documented silence in a way words could not. Meanwhile, Ellen uncovered more. She found mention of a particular officer whose name appeared in both the inspection reports from 2017 and the altered rosters of 2018. His full name never surfaced, always buried under redaction or initials, but the shadow of repetition remained. It was the first hint of a figure tied across multiple failures. Still, Ellen cautioned patience. If we name him now, they'll bury the file deeper. We wait. We build the record stronger. For Marisol, waiting felt like drowning. Each day without her brother thickened the air. She would wake at dawn, boil water, and stare at the wall of evidence. The envelopes glowed in the lamplight. Sometimes she swore she heard humming from them, faint and rhythmic, as though Daniel's voice had been pressed into the paper. Red herrings crept in again. A caller left a message on her machine claiming to be Daniel himself. The voice was shaky, distorted. "I'm alive," it said. "Don't search." But when traced, the call came from a payphone miles away. No fingerprints, no verification. Belief surged for a moment, then collapsed. Marisol played the message again and again, listening for truth in the static. Her mother was convinced. "It's him," she said. "He's telling us to stop." But Marisol heard only manipulation, another layer of silence masquerading as voice. The press returned with more questions. A young reporter asked her, "Do you believe your brother is alive?" She could not answer. Belief and fact had grown so tangled that neither word felt safe. The evidence wall had become her compass. It was crowded with papers, but the center never changed. The gray envelopes. Each one stood unbroken, heavier with time. She photographed them again and sent the images to Ellen. "If they vanish too," she wrote, "we'll still have proof they were here." That night, a storm swept through town. Rain hammered against the windows, wind rattled the frames. The newspaper with the front page photo of the envelope lay on the counter. Water leaked through the roof, smearing the ink until the headline blurred into nothing. Marisol stared at the washed-out page, her brother's absence mirrored in print. The storm passed, the envelopes remained. The article headline blurred under sudden rain, letters dissolving into gray. The abandoned prison wing stood like a carcass at the edge of the yard, its windows barred with rust and its doors chained but loose. When Ellen managed to secure limited access for inspection purposes, Marisol walked through the entrance with a single flashlight in hand. The air smelled of iron and mildew, the residue of years of storms seeping through cracks. Each step stirred dust that glittered briefly before disappearing back into the dark. The cell tiers echoed with her movement. Paint peeled in long strips, curling down like parchment. Graffiti lined the walls, old and faded. Names scratched into concrete, dates etched in rough hands. She paused at a corner where the fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, more alive than the rest. It flickered in rhythm, almost like a pulse. Ellen followed behind with a notepad. "They said this wing was closed in 2016, she murmured. "But records show staff logged in here until the week your brother vanished." Marisol shone the light toward the end of the corridor. Rows of lockers stood crooked, their metal doors dented, many without locks. She opened one after another. Empty, empty, scraps of cloth, a broken toothbrush. Then, inside the last locker on the bottom row, she saw it. A folded sheet of lined paper, yellowed at the edges, tucked into a gray envelope. Her hands shook as she lifted it. The seal was already torn, fragile with age. Inside, one page remained. It carried Daniel's handwriting, jagged and hurried. She knew it instantly. The way he pressed hard on the downstrokes, the faint slant of his letters. The words began clearly. "If something happens, know that." And then it ended. The ink stopped mid-sentence, cut as though the pen had been pulled away. Her throat tightened. She held it toward Ellen, who scanned the page under the flashlight beam. "It's his," Ellen whispered. "But it tells us nothing. Not finished, not dated." They bagged the fragment carefully. Forensic technicians later would note that the ink was consistent with pens issued in the prison, but the page itself was incomplete, refusing to cross the line between evidence and rumor. Back home, Marisol placed the new envelope on her wall. 6 now, each different, each heavier. Together they told a story not of presence but of interruption, a life cut mid-sentence, mid-line, mid-breath. Her mother lit another candle. Neighbors came by, staring at the wall, whispering prayers. The envelopes had moved beyond family relics. They had become cultural artifacts among the community of the vanished. People touched them for hope, even as they carried only silence. But belief and fact clashed again. A retired officer, speaking to a local journalist, insisted the abandoned wing was never used after 2016. "They're chasing ghosts," he said. "That paper could be planted. Families see what they want." The journalist published both sides, letting readers decide. The page from Daniel's hand became another battlefield. Some called it proof of warning. Others claimed it was forgery. The state remained silent. Ellen prepared to file another motion in court. She wanted the fragment entered as evidence, an artifact tied to Daniel himself. But Marisol hesitated. "What if it disappears like the others?" she asked. "What if they take it from us?" "Then we'll make copies," Ellen replied. "Paper breeds when you share it. That's how you fight erasure." Still, Marisol feared the same pattern. Envelope arrives, evidence vanishes, silence grows. She photographed the fragment from every angle. She posted it on community boards, careful to block part of the sentence so only she held the full text. It was her attempt at control in a story where every trace slipped away. The vigils grew larger. Families carried envelopes of their own, ordinary stationery now elevated into ritual. They waved them like flags, symbols of those lost inside the system. The courthouse steps glowed with candlelight, the air thick with whispered names. Yet the opposition hardened. Rumors swelled that Daniel had staged his disappearance, that the half-written page was his farewell. "He walked away free," someone said. "He wanted to leave it all." Marisol wanted to scream. Instead, she pinned the fragment tighter to the wall, sealing it among the others. She told herself it was not farewell, but interruption. The ink had stopped because something had stopped him. That night, she sat alone, staring at the envelopes under lamplight. Their seals gleamed faintly, like closed eyes. The fragment's unfinished words echoed in her mind, louder than any complete sentence could have been. She pressed her hand to the wall, as though touching the page might push the sentence forward. But silence pressed back harder. Outside, the abandoned wing loomed dark against the sky. The wind rattled its broken windows, carrying hollow notes through the rusted bars. The handwriting ended mid-sentence, cut short by silence itself. The civil suit moved forward slowly, like paper dragged through water. Ellen filed the motion with the court, attaching every copy of altered rosters, redacted pages, and the fragment of Daniel's handwriting. She argued that these were not coincidences or clerical slips, but evidence of systemic neglect. The state's attorneys responded with polished indifference, insisting no wrongdoing had occurred, that all irregularities were administrative in nature. Marisol sat in the courtroom, the gray envelopes stacked neatly in a folder on her lap. She had refused to let them out of her sight this time. The last time she surrendered one, it vanished into records without trace. Now she held them like living things, their weight grounding her. The judge listened in silence as Ellen laid out the sequence. An unlocked cell at 4 a.m., a blank logbook, a camera outage timed too perfectly, rosters altered, key cards redacted, evidence lost. She ended with the fragment of Daniel's handwriting, projecting it on the screen. "If something happens, know that..." The words hovered unfinished above the court, heavier than testimony. The state's attorney stood and dismissed it all as speculation. "A half-written sentence cannot prove misconduct," he said flatly. His voice carried no tremor, only the rhythm of dismissal. When it was over, the judge announced that the case would not proceed to trial. "Insufficient grounds," he said, tapping his gavel once. The sound echoed too long in Marisol's ears. Outside, the courthouse steps filled again with families. They held candles, photographs, envelopes of their own. One woman whispered, "They'll never admit it. They'd rather erase than confess." Another added, "The silence is the confession." Ellen placed a hand on Marisol's shoulder. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. "We can appeal. We can push for depositions." Weeks later, a sealed deposition arrived at Ellen's office. It had been filed in a separate proceeding against the Department of Corrections. The document, stamped confidential, admitted that the locks in cell block C had malfunctioned. One warden acknowledged in sworn testimony that doors sometimes failed to secure properly, including the tier where Daniel had been housed. Ellen brought the paper to Marisol. "Here," she said. "At last, a crack in their wall." Marisol read the lines again and again. The acknowledgement proved what she had suspected all along. The system itself had failed. Yet it did not name who had moved through that door, nor what had happened to her brother after. The silence remained. She placed the deposition on her evidence wall. Above it, she pinned the envelopes in a vertical line. From ordinary letters, they had become relics, then ritual, then evidence. Now, under the glow of the lamp, they looked like exhibits waiting for a trial that would never come. At the next hearing, Ellen insisted the envelopes be entered formally. She carried them in a clear plastic bag, labeled and sealed. The clerk accepted them, logged them, and slid them into a box. Marisol watched every movement, memorizing the chain of custody this time. When the judge ordered the box sealed for record, the lights above flickered. For a moment, the envelopes inside glowed faintly, their gray paper pressed into silence by official decree. Marisol sat frozen. The very objects that had carried her through months of erasure were now locked away, hidden again, their silence folded into the bureaucracy. She whispered to herself, "At least they exist in the record." But the words carried little comfort. That night, she returned home to a wall with gaps. Where the envelopes had once hung, only outlines remained. Taped corners empty. The house felt colder without their presence. Her mother lit candles beneath the empty spaces, whispering prayers. Ellen promised appeals, petitions, pressure. But Marisol only stared at the gaps, hearing Daniel's voice humming in the silence, unfinished, cut short. The clerk sealed the envelopes as the courtroom lights dimmed. Winter arrived, soft and gray, yet no answer followed. The prison carried on as if nothing had ever happened. Guards walked their rounds. New inmates filled the cells. Rosters were filed and stored. But for Marisol, the silence remained louder than routine. She kept a photograph of Daniel on the mantel, his eyes caught mid-laughter from years before. Beside it stood the final envelope, the only one never entered into court, the only one she had hidden from everyone, even Ellen. It rested in the top drawer of her nightstand, edges stiff, seal unbroken. She often sat with it in the evenings, candle burning nearby, listening to the weight of its silence. Her mother urged her to open it. If it holds words, we need to know. If it holds nothing, we need to face it. But Marisol resisted. The unopened seal had become more than paper. It was her brother's last trace, intact. Opening it felt like ending him. The forensic trail offered no rescue. A DNA swab collected from an abandoned uniform years later yielded only inconclusive results, degraded and partial. Reports trickled in, each stamped with the same words, unable to confirm. Evidence without confirmation, paper without voice. Neighbors carried new rumors. Some swore they had seen Daniel in New Orleans, moving with a crowd on Bourbon Street. Others claimed he had crossed the border south, living quietly under another name. Each rumor folded on itself, belief chasing belief, never meeting fact. Marisol withdrew further. The evidence wall remained, but dust began to gather at its edges. The rosters curled, the photographs yellowed. Yet the space where the envelopes had hung stayed clear, as though the paper had burned the outlines into permanence. On the porch, she sometimes sat with a candle lit, watching the road. People stopped to speak softly, offering condolences or repeating fragments of rumor. She nodded, but her eyes always returned to the sealed drawer. One evening, Ellen visited, exhausted but determined. "We can't stop," she said. "Even if the courts refuse, the story matters. We'll publish. We'll place everything in public record." Marisol listened, but her gaze drifted to the drawer. Ellen noticed and asked, "Another envelope?" Marisol nodded slowly. "The last one. I never gave it up." Ellen's voice softened. "Then guard it. It may be the only truth left." That night, Marisol placed the envelope beside Daniel's photograph. The candlelight flickered against the gray paper. She touched the edges, feeling the weight again, heavier than it should be, as if holding breath. The silence in the house deepened. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even her mother's prayers in the next room, all faded beneath the envelope's presence. Years had passed. No grave had been found, no body returned, no closure granted. Only silence stretched across the gap where a man had once lived. The envelope remained sealed. The envelope waits, edges yellowing, silence pressing inside.